Thursday, April 19, 1945. The Wehrmacht report announces the end of the Ruhr pocket on April 17, where around 5 million people were present: soldiers, civilians, prisoners of war, and forced laborers. The battle between the Ruhr and the Rhine is over. For weeks of heavy fighting, troops under the command of Field Marshal Model have tied down superior forces from 2 American armies and, in exemplary fulfillment of their duty, resisted them to their last breath. The enemy suffered heavy losses in men and material. In the central and lower Harz, our troops are withstanding the strong assault. The Americans stood. The enemy suffered losses in parts of the Bergisches Land and near Düsseldorf and Duisburg until the 21st. Resistance was offered until April 21st, but with the capture of the majority of the staff officers, the Army Group B, led by General Field Marshal Model, in the Schwarzbach Valley near Remagen, had stopped being a fighting force with the remnants of its 2 armies, as the blue-bordered Army Group. The enemy: 26 generals, 1 admiral, and around 300 of the most senior officers. The major units involved were, and around 325,000 men had gone into captivity. The major units included the light green-marked 15th Army, under General of the Infantry Gustav Adolf von Zangen, with the 74th Army Corps and the 81st Army Corps troops of von Zangen, with the 74th Army Corps and the 81st. The purple-marked 5th Panzer Army under Colonel General Joseph Habe, with the 12th SS Army Corps, which suffered losses, and the 80th Army Corps. In addition, there was the dark green-marked Army Detachment von Luttwitz, with the 47th Panzer Corps, as well as Unterharz Troops Assault, 47th Panzer Corps, as well as the 63rd and 53rd Army Corps and the 3rd Flak Corps, under Lieutenant General Heino von Ranschau. It all began in early February 1945, when the front was still on Dutch soil along the West Wall, between Nijmegen and Roermond. Between the defensive installations, there was the so-called Red Zone, an evacuation area about 10 kilometers wide, from which, at the urging of the Allied troops, a large number of civilians living there were brought to the rear territory, on foot or by rail transport. However, this became increasingly risky, as during the day the Allied fighter bombers dominated the airspace. They not only fired on German military vehicles and convoys, but also targeted individual civilians, cyclists, or farmers working in the fields. Trains were considered especially valuable targets, as it was assumed they were transporting German troops or supplies. But when they arrived on the 8th, on February 8th, when they attacked a freight train carrying evacuated Dutch families from Roermond, 15 Dutch civilians were killed. On February 16th, during 2 heavy air raids, most parts of the city of Wesel were destroyed, and 322 civilians lost their lives. At the beginning of March, Field Marshal Model had set up the headquarters of his Army Group Moss at the Katzmann Inn in Rimbach, near Altenkirchen in the Westerwald. After American troops had reached the left bank of the Rhine at various points, on the 7th March, advance units of the 9th pushing forward from the Ahr Valley. U.S. Armored Division encountered the railway bridge at Remagen, which, although attacked and damaged by Allied aircraft in the previous months, was still relatively intact. The Ludendorff Bridge. And did they, I'll get to that in a moment, basically capture it by surprise? In fact, this important viaduct over the Rhine had also been prepared for demolition by the Wehrmacht. But in the chaos that prevailed during the last weeks of the war, instead of 600 kilograms of the pioneer explosive EK Akrasit, only 300 kilos were used, and instead of that, the industrial explosive Donnerit, which is usually only used for blasting rocks and buildings, was used. In any case, when the bridge was blown up, it was only lifted briefly and was hardly damaged. And because of the Army Group's misjudgment of the situation, as they were focused on the Cologne area, there was only a single bridge security company available to defend the bridge. With 36 men from the Convalescent Company 105, and 120 men from the 12th Company of the 12th Land Pioneer Regiment, a smoke company, and a so-called Phone Flak battery. This formidable force was to be reinforced, if necessary, by about 180 members of the local Hitler Youth, about 600 men of the local Volkssturm, and about 120 Russian volunteers who were only available on paper and were under the command of the responsible 18th Volksgrenadier Division, Lieutenant General Walter Boch. The 2 infantry battalions promised to the bridge combat commander, 1 artillery battalion, and 1 8th Flak battery to be used for anti-tank defense, never arrived. For this, the anti-aircraft flak batteries previously stationed at the bridge had been withdrawn, except for the phone battery. In any case, after the failed destruction of the Ludendorff Bridge and its subsequent capture by the Americans on March 7th the 3rd. On March 8th, by order of Hitler, the so-called summary court-martial known as Fliegende Standgericht West, which had just been established, was put into action under the legally inexperienced Major General Rudolf Hübner, and they had charged the combat commander designated for the defense of the bridge, Major Hans Scheller, who, however, could not take over due to the unclear situation. The chief of the engineer company stationed in Remagen, Major August Kraft, who in turn was subordinate to the also accused Major Herbert Strobel, the commander of the engineer regiment staff, Mott 51, and the Luftwaffe First Lieutenant Karl-Heinz Peters, leader of a battery equipped with Henschel HHS 297 phone rocket launchers in the Flak Training and Experimental Unit 900R, meaning anti-aircraft rockets, anti-aircraft rocket launchers. This young officer had been convicted because he used his classified anti-aircraft rocket launchers for close-range air defense. He had not destroyed them for the Americans, but had tried to bring them to the other side of the Rhine. However, some of the phone launchers had been captured by the Americans. After the flying court-martial, West had deliberated for 3 days in inns in Rimbach and Oberirsen. All officers held responsible had been sentenced to death in legally untenable verdicts. Here is the publication in the Wehrmacht report. On March 13, Scheller and Peters were shot in this forest near Rimbach, and Kraft and Strobel on the 14th in Oberirsen. The responsible bridge commander and leader of the local Volkssturm, captain of the reserve, Willy Bradke, had also been sentenced to death, but escaped execution because he had previously fallen into American captivity. In any case, starting from March 7, the Germans had made massive attempts, including the use of V-2 rockets, and according to American sources, 367 Air Force attacks, heavy artillery bombardments, and the deployment of combat swimmers to finally bring down the Ludendorff Bridge. However, 4 combat swimmers were captured, and American anti-aircraft guns managed to shoot down 26 German planes. It wasn't until March 17 that the bridge, which had been hit several times by then, finally collapsed. According to an official American source, 28 U.S. soldiers were killed and 93 wounded, while a German source reported 32 U.S. soldiers killed. However, by that time, 6 U.S. divisions had already crossed the bridge, and several pontoon bridges had been built, so the Ludendorff Bridge no longer played any role in the further course of the war. The fanatical non-soldier propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels wrote in his diary on March 4th, No light signals. Only with such measures can we still save the Reich. I urgently ask the Führer to continue his measures in this manner, so that our leading officers are finally forced to obey. And the Field Marshal Kesselring, who has been appointed as Supreme Commander West since March 11 here, after his capture by U.S. soldiers on the 10th. On May 10th, near Berchtesgaden, announced the verdict against the responsible officers of the Remagen Bridge by daily order. I hereby order again that every case of failure is to be reviewed and dealt with by court as quickly as possible, and I expect the courts-martial to act with the utmost severity and strictness. And General Field Marshal Model, whose staff had become partly responsible for the overall situation due to misjudgment, for the confusion of orders and situation at the bridge, wrote in the daily order of the Army Group regarding the verdict of the Flying Court-Martial West. He who fears an honorable death dies in disgrace. Back to March 7th, to the only slightly damaged Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen. When the commander of Company A of the 27th arrived at the viaduct early in the afternoon, U.S. Tank Grenadier Battalion in the 9th, Tank Vision Lieutenant Karl Heinrich Timmermann, after discovering the intact structure, immediately took the initiative, stormed the barely defended bridge with his soldiers, and sent the report. We have an intact bridge over the Rhine at checkpoint 15. Should I continue to hold this bridgehead in anticipation of a new deployment to the south? We have a company on the other side. However, this monumental battle painting was more a product of the artist's imagination, just like the print published by the U.S. War Department in 1945. Here you can see the captured German prisoners from the hopeless forces defending the bridge. The capture of the bridge by the Americans, contrary to some reports, was not decisive for the outcome of the war, given the technical superiority of the U.S. Army over the defeated German army, but was merely another episode from the fighting on German territory at the end of the war. In contrast, there are always rumors surrounding the prisoner of war camp known as the Golden Mile, located between Remagen and Sinzig, which I do not wish to address. In any case, during the fighting in the Remagen area, more and more German soldiers were taken prisoner by the U.S., including several in civilian clothes, possibly apprehended deserters, who were now being held in very cramped conditions on the so-called Golden Mile. With an initial 250,000 more Germans after the end of the Ruhr pocket, with another 325,000, making a total of 660,000. Regarding the problematic issue of the Rhine Meadow camps, also caused by the initial lack of rights for the German prisoners, I have this video. You can also find the link in the video text. The conqueror of the bridge, Timmermann, whose grandfather Arnold Timmermann emigrated from Twistringen, southwest of Bremen, to the USA with his family in 1869 and settled in Nebraska, was on the 19th. He was born on June 19, 1922 in Frankfurt am Main Niederrad, where his father John was a U.S. occupation soldier. However, he had left his unit without permission to enjoy the Dolce Vita, met and fell in love with Miss Maria Franziska Weisbecker while dancing, and on the 15th. He married her on April 15, 1922 in Frankfurt Höchst. In 1924, he returned to the USA with his family. After Lieutenant Timmermann, together with the first soldier to cross the bridge, Staff Sergeant Alexander Albert Drabeck, from the U.S. President, with whom on the 18th was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, which was established on March 18, 1918, and has only been awarded 13,462 times to this day, the order just below the Congressional Medal of Honor. Timmermann had, in his eyes, restored the soldierly family honor, which had been stained by his undisciplined father. Karl Heinrich, who was later promoted to first lieutenant and served in the Korean War, is on the 21st. He died of cancer on October 21, 1951, in Denver, Colorado, at the age of 29. He was survived by his wife, Lavera Lorraine Meyer Hansen, whom he married in 1943, and their daughter, Gay Diane, who was born in 1945. In any case, when Timmermann's report reached General Eisenhower's staff, the 1st U.S. Army, starting on the 7th March, redirected its divisions, which had been pinned down near Cologne, in forced marches to the Ludendorff Bridge, and shortly thereafter established a steadily growing bridgehead on the right bank of the Rhine, which in the following days could no longer be eliminated despite constant attacks by command units of the German 15th Army and the Luftwaffe. From the bridgehead, which had been expanded to a width of 50 kilometers by March 22, the 1st U.S. Army then advanced on the 25th of March with its divisions toward the east, with the 7th Corps belonging to this army, which later turned north from the Eastern Valley and, after a nearly 100-kilometer day-long march on the 30th of March, reached the district town of Breilen in the northeastern Sauerland. Meanwhile, starting on March 23rd in the north, British Field Marshal Bernhard Montgomery initiated Operation Plunder with a 4-hour artillery barrage from 4,000 guns in preparation for crossing the northern Rhine and advancing from there into northern Germany. British divisions are shown in red, German ones in light green. Plunder included, starting from the 24th, Operation Varsity, which is considered the largest airborne operation ever carried out on a single day and at a single location, involved more than 16,000 paratroopers and several thousand aircraft. To secure and support the British ground troops who had crossed beyond Issel and the Rhine as they expanded their bridgehead, were part of the 1st Allied Airborne Army under U.S. Lieutenant General Louis Hyde Brereton, the British 6th Airborne Division, and the American 17th Airborne Division landed by air in blue-bordered drop zones on the eastern bank of the Rhine, just west of Hammenkelln and Wesel, where they were met by the defending battle group of the German 84th during the formation of the bridgehead. Infantry Division under Major General Heinz Fiebig. The 84th was able to inflict heavy losses on the British and Canadians, but by the end of March, it was destroyed by their air and ground forces. Parts of the 7th had also confronted the attackers in the area between Burgerford, Meerhoog, and Haldern. Paratrooper Division, under their commander, Lieutenant General Wolfgang Erdmann, who, on the 5th September 1946, committed suicide in British captivity in Munster. The result of the successful Rhine crossing by Montgomery's 21st Army Group near Wesel and the expansion of the bridgehead, which grew larger every day, in connection with the swift advance of the 9th under his command. The U.S. Army north of the Lippe, advancing eastward, now posed the imminent threat of encirclement for Army Group B. As a result, the remnants of the 116th, which had been almost completely destroyed on the Normandy front, Panzer Division under Major General Siegfried von Waldenburg, launched a counterattack between the Lippe and Sauerland. In doing so, this division, with its few thousand soldiers and a dozen tanks, faced 50,000 men from the 30th and 35th U.S. Infantry Divisions, and the 84th U.S. Infantry Division, as well as the 4th Canadian and the 8th U.S. Armored Division. What was left of the 116th Panzer Division on April 16th surrendered that day. A small battle group from it, which had been moved behind the Weser in time, surrendered on April 21st as part of the 66th. Army Corps in the Harz Mountains laid down their arms to keep the access to Paderborn open against the advancing tank spearheads of the 3rd U.S. Armored Division on the 30th. On March 30th, south of Paderborn, the German units assembled from the Senne training area Sennelager attacked. These consisted of all available personnel from the officially named Westphalen Armored Training Units, which then bore the name SS Brigade Westphalen, or SS Replacement Brigade Westphalen. It was formed on the 28th. On March 28th, under Obersturmbannführer Hans Stern, who came from the army and was transferred to the Waffen-SS in 1943, and after the war became a lieutenant colonel in the Bundeswehr. The brigade consisted of 2 quickly formed infantry regiments named after their commanders. Regiment Meyer, with the 2 SS Panzer Reconnaissance Training and Replacement Battalions 1 and 2, as well as an SS Panzer Reconnaissance NCO Training Battalion. The 2nd Regiment, Holzer, with 3 battalions, was led by Obersturmbannführer Friedrich Holzer and came from the SS Panzer Training and Replacement Regiment in Augsdorf. In addition, there were 2 companies with Tiger II tanks from the Heavy Tank Battalion 507 here in September 1944 before their transfer to Hungary. As usual, the numbers regarding German units vary widely. According to an American source, the brigade had about 60 Tiger and Panther tanks. According to another, more accurate source, it only had 15 old training Panzer III tanks, 3 tank destroyers, and, in the 2nd and 3rd companies of the Heavy Tank Battalion, 507-21 Tiger the Tutor Todakasi. During the heavy fighting south of Paderborn on the 30th, the commander of the 3rd U.S. Armored Division, Major General Morris Rose, was killed in action as the highest-ranking U.S. officer on the European theater of war. Rose, who, together with his adjutant Major Robert Bellinger and his driver Technical Sergeant V. Glenn Sharns, encountered tanks of the Westphalen Brigade during a reconnaissance drive with his jeep near Hamborn Castle by Kirchborchen in the evening, tried to escape and crashed into a tree. Instead of surrendering and raising his arms, he apparently made a wrong move, which looked like he was reaching for his pistol, and was then commanded by a tank. He was shot by the tank commander, who of course didn't know who he had in front of him in a single jeep. His 2 companions, who had dropped their belts with their weapons in time and taken cover, managed to escape. The U.S. press made up a special lie about the death of General Rose, which is not worth going into detail about. In addition, there are speculations about the murder of German comrades, prisoners, by U.S. soldiers at Schloss Hamborn. For example, the former Bundeswehr lieutenant colonel and military writer Ulrich Saft reports this in his book, War at Home Until the Bitter End in the Harz, from an eyewitness account stating that American soldiers, without orders and spontaneously, shot 8 Waffen-SS soldiers who had just been captured. Saft cites the death of the general and the heavy losses suffered by the Americans in the days before as possible motives. However, after the deployment of the Westphalen Brigade had failed and Paderborn had to be abandoned, the remnants of the brigade, starting from the 31st March, began their retreat toward the Weser, repeatedly engaging in battles with the pursuing 3rd U.S. Armored Division. Meanwhile, starting on the 25th of March, the Panzer Lehr Division, which had been replenished at the Senne training area after its heavy losses in Normandy under Major General Horst Niemack, marched through the Hochsauerland, attempting to break out eastward from the encroaching pocket. After Niemack, who later became a Bundeswehr Reserve Brigadier General, was severely wounded from the 3rd onward. In April, Colonel Paul Freier von Hauser, who was from Graz, took command of the Panzer-Lehr Division. Remnants of the 9th had joined them. Panzer Division, whose commander, Major General Harold Freier von Elberfeld, on the 6th March, had fallen during the heavy street fighting in Cologne, and was now led by Colonel Helmut Zollenkopf, as well as the 3rd Panzergrenadier Division under General Walter Dankert. However, all efforts were futile, as the Allied Air Force, which had absolute control of the airspace, destroyed any movement of the 3 German units southeast of Winterberg. Then, on April 1st east of Lippstadt, the forward elements of the 9th U.S. Army and the 1st met. U.S. Army, which meant that Army Group B, along with the remnants of at least 20 divisions in total, was now encircled. However, the U.S. forces took their time eliminating the pocket and first deployed 18 well-equipped divisions, without weakening their further advance into central Germany. While the fully motorized U.S. troops initially advanced only slowly in the mountains of the Sauerland, fighting against smaller German units, progress was faster in the northern lowlands. On April 4, due to the city's resistance after 3 days of artillery shelling and air raids, the 8th U.S. Armored Division, attacking from the eastern side of the pocket, captured the town of Erwitte. The castle located in this town served as a Reich training center for the German Labor Front and the NSDAP during the Third Reich. In addition, Erwitte, which was supposed to be defended by 2 companies of the 116th Panzer Division, Waffen-SS, Flak, and Volkssturm units, lay at the strategically important intersection of what was then Reichsstrasse 1 and 56. The Volkssturm units consisted of members of the so-called Freikorps Sauerland, which had been formed after the announcement to establish the German Volkssturm in September 1944 by the Gauleiter of Westphalia South, Albert Hoffmann, and it included at least a dozen Volkssturm battalions, some of which, when deployed in the Ruhr pocket, suffered significant losses. After the capture of Erwitte, the American armored units now continued their advance to the south, west, and northwest, pushing deep into the pocket along a broad front. At the same time, the 7th U.S. Armored Division advanced through the Möhne Valley to the northwest. All German breakout attempts and counterattacks failed against the overwhelming superiority of the U.S. troops. Then, starting from April 6th, as the pocket perimeter was slowly compressed from all sides, additional strong U.S. units advanced from the north via Hamm and from the south via Ludenscheid into the pocket, threatening to split it. After the OKW threatened the death penalty for not defending cities on April 12th, the Wehrmacht report stated on April 14th, "The bitter struggle on the Rhine and Ruhr, as well as in the Bergisches Land, continues with increasing intensity." Several breaches were still being fiercely fought over in the evening. Around April, 13 Field Marshal Model, here at the end of March in his headquarters, during a conversation with Armaments Minister Albert Speer, among others, recognized the hopelessness of the situation in the Ruhr pocket and decided not to follow Hitler's order to destroy the infrastructure. Then, on April 15, near Wetter an der Ruhr, the spearheads of the 8th and the 99th U.S. divisions met. The pocket was split into a larger western part with the 5th Panzer Army and a smaller eastern part with the remnants of the 15th Army, that is, the 116th Panzer Division, the Panzer-Lehr Division, as well as anti-aircraft and other units. But when, on April 17th, the commander of the 58th U.S. Airborne Corps, Major General Matthew Ridgway offered the Army Group the chance to surrender. It was refused by Model. However, on the 17th, the Field Marshal had decided to dissolve his Army Group without consulting Hitler, and ordered both the young and the older soldiers to be released so that they could return home disguised as civilians. The rest were to decide within the next 3 days whether to make their way home, surrender individually, or try to reach the next unit still fighting. 1 day later, on April 18th, the Wehrmacht report continued to express cautious optimism. Between Ruhr and Remagen, our divisions are separated into 2 groups and pressed closely together, engaged in the fiercest fighting against an enemy vastly superior in numbers and equipment. They defend every inch of ground tenaciously and stubbornly against the enemy attacking from all sides. The demand to surrender was answered by the garrison of Düsseldorf by destroying 17 tanks of the attacking enemy. However, after the eastern part of the pocket, along with the remnants of the 15th Army was overrun, the German units rapidly disintegrated, and the number of prisoners doubled every hour. Then, on the 19th April, the Ruhr pocket came to an end. Walter Model, who was promoted to Field Marshal on March 30th as the second-to-last German Colonel General, had been considered a master of defense at the latest since the heavy defensive battles on the Eastern Front. But Model, who was close to National Socialism, had long since recognized the senselessness of continuing the war, even though he still continued to carry out Hitler's orders. However, he was also one of the few field marshals who openly contradicted Hitler's way of conducting the war. After Model, as mentioned, had dissolved his army group and given his soldiers the opportunity to make their way home, that was not an alternative for him. On April 21, he shot himself in a wooded area near Duisburg. He was 54 years old.